Welcome back. Yeah. So our second guest for tonight is Marco Di Pasquale. Marco is an RIT alum, comes from the College of Business, a finance major from 1983. Went on to do some really incredible things. I've got a list of them here, if you don't mind me just kind of reading through them. Let's see, a client director, the lead global financial services sector for Optiv, the company. A diverse experience, including leading global and domestic teams. Responsibilities varied from sales, marketing, engineering, support, general management, P&L responsibility for over 27 years. A successful track record of driving successful and innovative teams, consistently overachieving sales operational goals. Consistent track record of creating team efficiencies and collaboration that yield maximum outcomes. Successful experience in developing long-term C-level relationships, which we were just talking about. Matching business relevance to clients' needs and disseminating to teams. Successful and ongoing mentor to employees, leading to their career and personal development progress. Led the Italian marketplace to refocalization and restructuring of security marketplace, and consistently surpassing goals in every facet of his career. That's awesome. I don't even know how all of this. Yeah, I know. Somebody sent it to me and said, "Oh, that Marco Di Pasquale? Yeah, we've got some stuff on it." So welcome, Marco. Appreciate your time tonight. I know my students are excited to hear from another alum who has gone on to do some wonderful things. And I'm going to let Sally in here really quick before we get started. Welcome, Sally. Tonight you've come with a presentation, and I'm going to let you just kind of get started. So thanks for being here.
No, thanks for having me, and I'm glad I got to do it for a second year. I really appreciate it, and I always look forward to talking to our future leaders of this economy. So appreciate everybody joining. Today, I'm gonna delve into identity and what identity is, and as simple as that word may be, how many implications trusting an identity and giving privileges to an identity, how many business implications as well as personal implications can be had by that being misused. So my agenda today is we've already run through who I am, so I won't go through that too much, except I'm going to touch on one piece of it I think that's interesting. Well, I wanted to give a snapshot through my eyes of where the cybersecurity landscape is, why I chose identity and where it makes sense, hopefully for all of you folks that are interested in cybersecurity and what it does, define some of the identity and what the components are of it, and where it plays into the cybersecurity landscape, some of the struggles that we find in the financial services world, and some legislation that'll be coming out, and try to get you ahead of the game. And I give some links as well. I'm going to be sharing this presentation in PDF format with Rick, and there'll be some links there if you want to dive a little deeper to go and look at it. And then the last piece I put in I always liked when I was in your seat, or if I'm in my seat today when people are speaking to me, how does this help me in my future, hopefully? So I'm going to talk a little bit about hiring. I also have a couple folks that I work with on the alumni, Sally Haig, that Rick just mentioned, as well as Jody Allison. And I'm going to blend in some real life examples outside of cyber and how identity is very relevant in the business world. As Rick mentioned, he talked about a lot of this already. So I'm going to skip over this one. But this second one is interesting for me. So when I first started in quote unquote cybersecurity 18 years ago, it was, and this is no knock on life insurance folks, because I think life insurance is actually a key vehicle in certain aspects and certain folks and time and place in their financial planning. But as you know, when insurance people come up to you, they look at you and they run the other way. Well, when I was first getting into this part of the business, it was like that. And it wasn't hot and sexy like cyber security is. It was called information security. And I've seen a very big evolution over the 18 years. And I'll talk to, when I go to the one slide, when I talk about the technology, I'll explain how much it's changed. And I think it'll blow some of your minds away. I've worked on very large projects, and over the years with financial or very large car manufacturers like Fiat and Chrysler and things like that. And I'll tell you one thing that's always key and important to understand. You're never going to eliminate risk in cyber. What you try to do is limit. You're trying to put governance and controls in place to limit the amount of risk and exposure that your firm has. Obviously, you're going to stop a lot of it, but it's a key part to understand. And the reason I want to bring it full circle here is if you look at where I started, I was doing finance and I was going to work on Wall Street, basically doing the same thing. You're maximizing your returns while minimizing your risks as much as possible. And I've come back to the full circle for the last 18 years doing the same thing, just in a different way, in a different manner. And just this last year, we spoke to security programs as a whole and how security programs are based on risk and managing risk. So to jump into the security landscape. So this is my present firm, Optivs. These are the 6 different practices that we have. And within each practice, we have hundreds upon hundreds of individual practitioners. What I'm going to talk about today is the identity and data management pillar there. That's our largest practice, actually. It's been around for a very long time compared to cyber digital transformation, which is like in basically embryonic stage if you compare it to identity. Identity and data management and how it ties though to all these different other types of services is essential to giving a comprehensive and full business outcome for a client. Or if you're working for ABC organization that does investment banking, you're in cyber, you're going to be working with a whole host of these different groups and areas, but you're also going to be working with the business leaders that are trying to execute on a host of different business initiatives with technology and with new initiatives in digital. This is a very small snapshot of how many vendors, technology vendors, people that sell hardware, software, hardware, SaaS, some managed services. We do managed services as well. So this is a quick, simple snapshot. And to show you how much that this area has evolved over 18 years, I could probably count on hands and toes how many vendors we were first starting to work with back 18, 20 years ago. So, and if you go back just 6 or 7 years, there's been an explosion. Now there's, several thousand vendors actually in the space. And because the reason is things have gotten more granular, more automated. I'll give some examples throughout the presentation of how and where that's happened. But to give you an idea, this is a very broad landscape. And, when I used to work in information security, it was much more, much smaller band, and the width was not as much as here. One thing else before I jump into identity that you should definitely keep in mind always is that cybersecurity is not about technology. It's about people, process, and then technology. And I can tell you when we go in with my subject matter expert consultants that are specialized in whichever area across those services that I mentioned, including identity, a lot of times, most of the business outcomes that we're trying to reach with our clients are around people and process, applying a policy that has been put in place. And the technology is oftentimes more of an enabler than really the true piece that gives you the outcome. But there is a triage working amongst the 3 pieces to give you what your cybersecurity program is. So I'm going to jump into identity and why I chose identity as a difference maker in today's day and age. So as we all see, things are changing consistently. And we live in a world where everything has gone digital. I can almost guarantee you most of the folks in the room as students rarely go to a brick and mortar bank. Most of them don't even go into a restaurant. They're using Grubhub or something like that versus When I was at RIT, we we didn't have any of that. If we got Domino's delivered, that was lucky if they went to the right dorm or apartment. So everything has gone digital. But the one thing that has not is our identities are still behind. The way they're managed and the way they are having to be treated within systems to ensure that there's not corruption happening. I'm going to show a cartoon that I think summarizes it up. It's been printed in several different areas, but I used it from this particular presentation I saw a little ways back. And most of you may have probably already seen it, but on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And it does sort of capture really the essence of talking about identity. Somebody can purport themselves to be somebody else very easily. And if you've captured the credentials of that somebody else and you're able to scale and leverage those to gain access to certain things, and we'll talk about that, there's a lot of issues. There are a lot of issues from a company perspective in when they're managing your data and your information. In the financial services world, it's extremely important because of some of the obvious areas that they're talking about. Your funds that you're working with day to day, your investments and things of that nature. So you have the security, the privacy, customer experience as well as important in identity. Transaction costs, we'll talk about that as well, and trust. So how are we trusting these folks? How are we going to understand and make sure that the people that we have under our control for they're using whatever your service is, whether it be Uber or whether it be a banking application, how are we making sure that all of these are being taken care of? I've added this slide. I'm not going to go through it too much today, but for those of you that are a little bit more interested and want to delve in, this is from DHS, and it's basic. Some of the basics of identity management. I will cover some of the very basics, and that's identity management is about the users, how they're signing in. One of the key parts that oftentimes gets neglected is the revocation part of it. And an employee leaves, and let's say that employee is a CFO, and she leaves, and there's some steps not taken to make sure that that revocation had happened. All of a sudden, it's not a technology, an IT issue, or a cybersecurity issue. It's an HR issue, and HR has to work within the confines and with these teams to be able to make sure the revocation happens in a timely manner. Same thing with verifying the person, validating them, verifying that the person still works there. There's a lot more deep areas that you can go into. For example, in verifying people, there are technologies out there that you can implement that says, well, I know Rick only really logs in certain hours or certain times, but yet he's logging in all of a sudden the last 3 nights at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he's coming from Russia. Why is that happening? There are things like that within identity management that you can control the type of access that you're giving to folks. And then obviously from there, the authorization pieces of it, which, authorization, and I'm going to focus a lot around authorization. The authentication pieces of it are important. The authorization pieces, though, are what make this new era of identity very essential. And last is approval. Making sure that you have what you're supposed to have. And within the digital identity, that last silo, that is something that all of the financial firms are struggling with. And hence why there's a whole host of legislation that's already on the brink. There's some others that are still being debated, but that are starting to take place around the actual identity, not around things like HIPAA or GDPR or any other types of PII information, but rather your actual identity and trying to help govern some of those of who you are and how you can protect yourself. Underlying there is as well as this is something, if you want to really dig into it, it could be interesting for you. All of these identity programs are built upon systems and infrastructure that have fraud controls, privacy controls, obvious, very different security controls. but also things like resiliency. If I need to get into my banking app and, you know, the city of New York has gone down in a power outage, what's my resiliency that it'll file over to somewhere else? So we're going to talk about the 3 A's of authentication, 3 A's of identity. First is authentication. Are you who you say you are? So that's the first piece, and there's a variety of different mechanisms that are run through to make sure of that. Then this is the key part to it, the authorization piece. And we're going to talk about dynamic authorization in a few slides and how that's extremely important with what's evolving in the marketplace today, specifically in the financial services world. So are you doing what you're supposed to be doing? So if, you know, Sally has logged into Bank of America and all of a sudden has access to areas that she should not be seeing, what's controlling that? How are we making very quick decisions to make sure that doesn't happen? And do you have what you're supposed to have? So in other words, are you getting the pieces and parts of your normal experience? So why is identity an issue? Why am I harping on this part of all those services and all those technologies that you see on the, by the way, out of those technologies, there's a whole 100 plus just in the identity world. Well, the reason that I harp on identity being an issue, I've heard different numbers over the years and it's always changing, but something like over 80% to 90% of all major breaches come from some sort of identity theft. They've compromised the identity and they've used the privileges that identity has, or sometimes if the privileges aren't exactly set up great, they're using very basic privileges and escalating and getting higher in the organization. One of the most famous hacks that really brought this whole scenario to the boardroom, because before the Target hack, back 8 years ago, I believe it was, off the top of my head. Before that breach, all of these were, quite honestly, they'd end up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, but there was never really a lot of action from the board. So as I mentioned, I've been working with this space for 18 years, and those first approximately 10 years, the chief security officers or the chief information security officers, those were the highest level executives that handled this part of the world in whoever it might be. Bear Stearns, Merrill Lynch, who neither of them no longer exist, but I give those examples so that there's nobody I'm pointing to. Those folks were personally liable for a lot of action, but they never had the ear of the board. The board of directors would, and what that also meant is that they rarely had the ability to gain funding or priority within other parts of the business to make security important. After the Target breach, and I put a link at the very bottom of this slide when you get it, if you want to see it, it's a really interesting CIO article that gives you a step-by-step 11 steps that the attackers took to hijack an identity of an HVAC vendor. So not a Target employee, not a Target executive, but rather an HVAC vendor, a third party. They leveraged that particular set of credentials, escalated it up, and created a whole storm of minutia. So that's the reason that we focus on identity. Identity is the essential part of all security programs. If you can have the best controls in the world to say that you are getting exposed, there's data being exfiltrated out of the organization. There's a whole host of different things that can tell you that there are problems. But if you can, we talked about what is cybersecurity. It is not about stopping all risk or stopping all threats. It's about limiting, and the best way to limit that risk is having a good, solid identity program. I'm going to pause there for a quick second, also just to grab a drink of water and just see if there's any questions as of yet. Okay. So to be a little bit clearer as far as why these credentials are so important, the credentials that there was approximately 70, just shy of 7,100 data breaches last year. And out of those in 2019, over 15 billion credentials were exposed. And what does that actually end up meaning? So these credentials are then sold on the black market in the dark web for as much as 70 cents to $2.15. But it doesn't stop there. It's what they do with those credentials once they're sold. They're leveraging a variety of different attacks onto enterprise customers and government agencies and governments in general to labor attacks that then create and show the way that they can go and find their ways to either compromise, take over, take down organizations and in exchange for money. When I was doing these presentations back in 2010, I believe it was when we first started claiming through a variety of different sources that the cybercrime had bypassed the drug crime. And it was around 2010, 2011. I'm going to show you some numbers that are pretty staggering. This is from a cybercrime magazine, Cybercrime Ventures. They, in 2015, they saw $3 trillion in cyber crimes. Worldwide, this is. 2021, they're expecting right around $6 trillion. And in 2025, 10.5 trillion. Those are staggering numbers in growth. But I said to myself, I had not seen the numbers in a bit on where the drug crime is, just out of curiosity. And we know that there's, obviously we won't get into legalization and everything else, but still, it's still a serious problem out in the world. It's only $400 billion. I say only, but if you look at it, the cyber crime is 5 times the size that the drug crime is today. Cyber criminals have become full-on in the dark web, full-on companies. So has anybody heard of ransomware?
Me.
So if your firm ends up getting ransomware and they're asking for a ransom to unlock, let's say, some files that you have, you call a full-on help desk like you call Bank of America or you're calling Apple. These are full-bore service help desks that are built to help walk them through getting unlocked, but sending the Bitcoin or Ethereal or whatever the type of currency that they're using to unlock their files or whatever they've compromised. This is real stuff, folks. And tying it to the business and understanding how to tie it to the business is essential for all of you. Even if you don't end up in cyber, to understand how this affects the business is key. And whatever parts of the business you go into, it's important. I'm going to turn it over to Jody for a second. I'll let her give her accolades, but she's worked in the finance field. She's worked in also in the regulated energy field. And I'd love for her to speak to how is identity a concern for her. And remember, she's not in IT and she's not in cybersecurity. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jody.
Thanks, Marco. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. Jody Allison, I'm the Vice President of Transformation. I represent the business at Algonquin Power and Utilities Corp. And currently, the scope of my responsibilities is we are working to transform the business, and part of that involves a $400 million transformation from a technology perspective, as well as when Marco talked earlier about people, process, technology, making sure that we have that all put together. So a lot of work being done in that space. But prior to that, I worked in the financial services industry before I moved to regulated energy space. And I worked for Paychex, a local company you might be familiar with, and spent 19 years there and spent a lot of time focusing on the business side of the transactions that the company was engaged in, and led a large financial services organization. So this space is certainly IT is not my background. I graduated from RIT as an accounting major and have had the opportunity to work in a couple different capacities. But in my experience from a financial services perspective, I had responsibility for making sure that I had a $300 billion portfolio of money that moved through. And as you can imagine, this is back in the day when a lot of this identity access management was early on. And, we certainly had situations where we were moving a lot of money, and understanding who was the actual person engaging in those activities became extremely critical. And I'll say that from the perspective that I had to work as a business person to understand what the requirements were. I had to be able to articulate the outcomes so that I could work together with the IT team to make sure that they understood what was needed, what we needed to achieve, and then was able to make sure that we had the appropriate processes in place. I actually started the fraud investigation unit at Paychex, and I can speak to an actual situation. It was in the news media, so this is not confidential. But there was a case where there was an individual who posed as a created an identity and posed as different companies to run payroll, to steal money through the direct deposit ACH network. By the time we were done, he took $3 million from the industry in a very short period of time, from different cities across the United States. And as the business leader, my job was to look at the process and be able to say, here's what we need to be able to do, and work with the IT team to understand how are we able to do these things, but still do them in a safe manner and work in a way that's not going to be overly burdensome to our customers, but at the same time protect the business. And you might ask, well, of course you want to keep the money in the company and safe, but it's not about the money completely. It's about what sort of regulatory scrutiny does that open us up to if there's issues. So we actually started an industry coalition to start preventing those activities from happening, because once the credit card industry started closing those doors and started tightening up their controls, people just moved to different industries. So they moved to the financial services industry because they realized that there wasn't as much understanding and knowledge there, so they tried to exploit that business. So we had to actually create an industry coalition to help start to shut that down quickly. And the interaction between the IT organization and the business folks was critical to understanding what the needs were. I'll move to the really quickly. I'll move to the current space that I'm working in. So one of the things coming in from a transformational perspective, we talk a lot about understanding the strategy, the value delivery that's expected. I had to work together to create the operating model, the org design, understanding what we're trying to accomplish, understanding what the customer's demands are. Customer first, that's the name of our program, right? How do we accommodate the customer? I have swapping out most of the systems in the organization because there's very antiquated infrastructure, but my job is people, process, and technology, and how that all fits together. One of the first things that I have to do is I have a peer who is the CIO for transformation, and he needs to understand what my business outcomes are so we can together work to build the right programs. I looked at that list of vendors that Marco put up there. I was starting to play the game of counting how many of those I've interacted with. So it's helping together with the IT team to articulate what those needs are and making sure, I was telling Marco, I had just recently gone to the board to present this entire program and all this activity that's going through and what the business outcomes are. And when I was talking to the risk committee and talking about how we mitigated risk as far as the deployment and all of the business outcomes as far as what's expected, the one comment that they left with is, as the business person, I'm expected to make sure that the security is completely adequate for what we're doing. And, so making sure that I have that clear line of communication and understanding from my partners is absolutely critical to the success overall. So I hope that provides some color as to some of the things that, you know, that the business people are dealing with on a daily basis, that you as leaders and heading into this space are going to have to try to help support and lead. And it's challenging because you have to help those business folks be able to articulate it just as well as you do, but obviously in their own way. So those are really my thoughts as I was spending some time with Marco talking about this.
Thanks, Jody. That's fantastic examples as well. And hopefully that starts to crystallize for some of you where identity and cyber and business all have to touch each other and make it, you know, a single goal. I'm probably going to come back to Jody in a couple slides as well, because as you're rolling out these new technologies, there's an elephant in the room that's staring at all of us in the business world, and that's digital transformation. I've heard different numbers of years on various news, news outlets, but they say that what COVID and what this pandemic has caused is a fast forwarding of digital transformation across all industries, anywhere between, I've heard, 5 to 10 years. And what does that mean? That there are technologies and ways of doing business that are being fast forwarded because of the situation that we are in. And therefore, companies are launching these new digital properties, if you will. Think of them as that, properties. Those are assets that they have to enhance and make their existing customers. And don't forget, when I say a customer, it doesn't mean the bank only to, and Jody made me think of this when she was talking. It's not just the bank to their customers that are paying them for their services, but it's also their internal customers. So your internal customers have certain service levels that they need, and they're digital transformationalizing that part of it. So the internal part of it, and her example is a great example. They're putting up 3 major new systems that would oftentimes probably take and should take a lot longer. We were talking about this yesterday. You know, this is something that should be done over not just a very short window like they have it. But how do you balance the security, your compliance, which is also key in the sense that, you know, there's a lot of regulations in play, HIPAA, a bunch of PII, consumer protection information. There's also GDPR if you're dealing with the Europe folks. There are a lot of regulations you need to make sure that you're complying with, but you also need to be agile. You need to stay in front of your customer, your competitor, excuse me, to stay on top of your customer. So how do you manage all of that? How do you do all of that? And, you know, I'll give you a simple example of where things can get really dicey. Let's just say, I don't remember who came out with it first, whether it was Uber or Lyft, where you could do split fares. That's Uber and Lyft is something probably some of the students there know a little something about. And, you know, you got this, all of a sudden you got this feature on your app that you can do a split fare. Well, think how much security had to be put into when they came out with the business outcome that I want to say, when I go do a fare, I can split it between 2 different users and it's going to go to 2 different financial institutions. Just think if that's not done properly. So there's a lot. This is all has to do with digital transformation, staying agile, but you're trying to comply with all these different laws that are out there. You're also trying to protect the identity and the trust, what we talked about in slide 1, between you, the firm, and your end user customer. So it becomes very difficult and complex. And one of the ways that some of the technologies that are starting to roll out that sort of address that are what they call dynamic authorization. One of a former peer of mine, a good friend of mine, still works at Ping Identity. He is the chief evangelist. He works directly for the CEO. He's been, I think, on 180 webcasts or news interviews this year. He's been on CNBC once or twice. And if you Google him, his name is Richard Bird. I label him out as some of my sources because some of these slides are actually these last three here are directly from him that he's let me borrow. And it talks about dynamic authorization. And what that means is in real time, not 2 weeks from now or, a week from now, very granular ways to apply business logic to that end user that's trying to access information within the systems and giving them the proper controls and proper access with the right context. And do they have the right purpose? And it's something that's very dependent upon how well you've built your identity management program, that slide that we showed from DHS, and how flexible that is. But the bottom line is it takes a lot of engineering from the business in to explain how this has to be done. And it's a key part. And the reason I'm harping on this is a key part to being a successful person. And you can be, if you say, you know what, I just want to be really technical, I don't want to be a business person, that's absolutely fine. But even that really technical person still needs to be able to explain how if there's a particular issue, you can't just say, well, I've got an SQL injection. There's an old problem, an SQL injection on this server XYZ. Rather, the way to say it is, and because the very technical folks get pulled into the boardroom or get pulled into the CEO or line of business VP's office and says, well, what's going on here? Rather, you have to just say, well, we have a breach of a particular type of technology on your payment server, which means you can't pay X, Y, and Z. That little spin of the same exact thing, we understand that you know it a lot deeper, but being able to explain it in that way will make a big difference in how successful and how much contribution you give back to your organizations. So just wanted to harp on that. It's the way that the world is evolving with digital transformation, and in identity space, the word dynamic authorization is a key part to that. And how dynamic authorization, supports a new norm. I think, I look at this and it's sort of a busy slide a bit, but at the end of the day, what Jody got told in the boardroom a few days ago, saying that's great, you better make it work, but it better be secure, really sums up this whole slide, I think. I mean, there's the agility parts of it. There are the security parts of it. There are the compliance parts of it. It's making sure that you deliver something secure, obviously, under all the different laws and regulations of compliancy and your own security policies that you have internally. But lastly, you're doing it in an agile format, and you're doing it so that you can deliver things in a very deliberate and predictable manner. And that is part of the key to it, is being able to understand your identity and have the controls in place to know where things went wrong as well, and whatnot. As far as, some of the different legislation, again, you don't have to worry about writing these down. I'll be sending these out via the professor. But, these are a few different digital identity acts that are being really pushed hard that we should see. They got started a little ways back and they're pretty much close to being finalized. There's a national data privacy one. That one's a little further off. There's some competing pieces of legislation there. But just to give you an idea, the government is also acting, and they are putting forth areas. And that's going to change some of our lives as well. The last piece I'm just going to jump into here is, if I'm hiring for cyber executive or my clients, and this is what I'm going to talk about in these next 4 points, is direct feedback that we've had from my clients over the years. We had a roundtable. The FBI was doing a roundtable / forum at RIT about 4 or 5, maybe 6 years ago. And I had brought one of my clients from a local large regional bank, and we had a pre-meeting with Rick, the chief security officer at RIT, a few other folks, and the feedback that the clients that we brought to the table were around being able to, what I talked about a little bit before, being able to speak what the actual business impact is. In other words, not the technology, not the why things are happening, but rather what does it affect? So if I'm hiring somebody, or if I were to give guidance, if you were one of my mentees in this space, one of the things that one of the first things I would tell you is worry less about the third circle and the technology circle, but understand the people in the process and understand and measure and how to measure the risk. What are the different risks involved? And there are different risks too. There's technology risks, there's operational risks, there's financial risks, to name a few. So if you have that mindset and that optic, it will change the way that you can tackle and really become successful in any part of the space. Know how to tie the business risk to your cyber incident. I gave you the example earlier of, the server, and how you phrase that back to an executive or somebody that has to understand why there's been a recent breach. Keep up with the times. Digital transformation is just the beginning. I will tell you that trying to keep up with the industry right now is not easy compared to what it was 4 or 5 years ago. Things are changing on a constant basis, but it's a really interesting thing. I can honestly say that I never wake up in the morning and have a boring day. It's not like accounting, nothing against you, Jody, but GAAP rules have hardly changed at all in the 50 years that I've known. And the other piece to it is understand the trends in the marketplace. And what I mean by that is not necessarily, what I meant on the cybersecurity and digital transformation changes and things like that, but what is happening out there in the marketplace overall, and what are the changes that are affecting each of you on a constant basis. I also put vendoridentity.org for those of you that want to dig a little deeper into some of the things that are happening. That's a consortium. Jody mentioned the consortium they had put together around fraud. I think it was around fraud, if she said that, if I understood it right. And this is one around identity. Yep. See, I paid attention. I didn't have my bourbon yet, so I'm paying attention. But the Better Identity one is a consortium, I think, of about 25 different big players, some big credit card processors, some very large banks, a host of different folks that talk about, and they're the ones helping some of those legislations through. Those are some of the things that I would, if you want to be in the cyber world, take heed of those notes of risk, and less about technology, even though technology is important and it's really cool and sexy sometimes. But what is that technology? Just think of it this way. What is that technology going to help? How is it going to help my program overall? And if you take that angle at it, you will be a rock star. I'll pause now for questions. Feel free, Rick, if there are any. I don't know.
So I'm watching
Marco,
chat.
It's Jody.
There you go. Go ahead.
Marco, it's Jody. If I could just say one more thing. If, for what Marco just said on this slide, what does it mean for you? Take this to the bank, because, looking at a lot of the regulated industries in particular, they don't have endless amounts of money, but they're competing against Amazon-like experiences, and they've got like systems from the 1980s that want, the 80s are calling, they want their systems back, right? Like, so there's the rate in which you're trying to get to that digitalization is great. So business people are being faced with needing to articulate what risks they're willing to accept or not. And so that ability to articulate that becomes extremely important. So Marco has given you a huge gift here in what he has laid out. And I think that's where, if you keep that front of mind, like, that will help you be very successful in making sure that the outcomes that are achieved are not just successful business outcomes, but successful enterprise outcomes. So just thought I'd share that. It was something that struck me as you were speaking, Marco.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, no, that plays. I mean, the people process technology piece plays right into what we teach at RIT in the MIS program, right? It is systems thinking, and we started this class kind of as an outgrowth. What is systems thinking and cybersecurity, and what does that mean? And so not only are you speaking to the choir, but you're speaking very loudly and wonderfully, because obviously it is this piece that we're trying to convey to these future project managers. Really, there are a handful of students from MIS with, like you said, accounting backgrounds, finance backgrounds, marketing backgrounds, right? And all of those have a space. I know in our earlier conversation today, Sonia, one of our students, had asked, what are the recommendations I should be looking at for getting into cyber? And our previous speaker, Chris Muscovitis, showed the slide, which it literally covered probably 80 different fields within cyber that you could do. And it's exactly right. I mean, you're a living proof of, finance major at RIT or accounting major at RIT. And look, I'm dealing directly with cybersecurity because I understand, I can translate, I can interpret what this means to the business. And that's the key piece of it, I think.
Yep.
So, all good. Any questions from the students tonight? I see it. Tell us more. Oh, no, that's old. Sorry. Avi, you're welcome. That's a thank you to you for being here tonight, and also to me for inviting RIT parents.
Great.
So yeah, we reached out to the parents group with this as well, because some of the students are in the classes and some are not, but that's okay. And thanks to all of our students that are guests that aren't students tonight as well for being here. No other questions popping up here.
Okay.
You covered it all.
No, thanks for having me on, Rick. I really appreciate this opportunity. And Jody and Sally, thanks for the support as always.
Thank you very much. It's a great opportunity.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So I just want to say this too. Marco is actually, you're the last of our alumni speakers for this semester seminar. We've had 4 alum, and then we had 4 prior at the 6 o'clock hour, kind of the rock stars, if you will, of the videos that we've been watching in class. They all agreed to kind of answer the questions we were having. So it's been interesting and a fun ride, but we found out at the end that I only had men on for 4 weeks straight. So Jody, maybe you're going to get an invite for our next seminar in February, starting in February. So just wanted to alert you, I guess. And thanks for helping out tonight. Really appreciate your time.
Oh, you're welcome. It was very enjoyable. Thank you.
You bet. If there are no other questions for tonight, then I'm going to wrap this up. Thanks again to Marco for being here and sharing the knowledge of the real world with us, stuck in the school. And I'm going to let everybody else go and say thanks for making this 4-week seminar series a great success. Let me also thank my interpreters one more time for being here, Melissa and Steph. Really appreciate you helping us out tonight. And again, to the students, thanks for being here. Probably your last class with me this semester. So I'll see you in Slack or an email before you head out for Thanksgiving. And to all, a happy Thanksgiving, and we'll catch you soon, I'm sure. All right. I will also Slack out the PDF that Marco sends later tonight.
Yep, I'll send it right now. Thank you.
Awesome. Again, thanks everybody.
Cheers.
Take care.
Have a good
Have a great
Thanksgiving,
night.
everyone.